The First World War on African soil. The immediate consequence for Africa of the declaration of war in Europe was the invasion by the Allies of Germany's colonies. Neither side had prepared for war in sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, there was short-lived hope that it might be isolated from the war. Governor During of Togo suggested to his neighbours in British Gold Coast, now Ghana, and French Dahomey, now Benin, that Togo should be neutralized so that the spectacle of Europeans fighting each other would not be witnessed by their African subjects. In German East Africa, now Tanzania, the governor, Dr. Schnee, was intent on avoiding hostilities so he could pursue his energetic program of development, and when the British bombarded Dar es Salaam shortly after the declaration of war, he subscribed to a short-lived truce that would neutralize German East Africa. There was even optimism in some quarters that the articles of the Berlin Act of 1885 covering the neutrality of the conventional basin of the Congo would avert war in East Central Africa. The forces in favor of involving Germany's African possessions in the war were, however, more pressing. From the point of view of Britain, given her naval supremacy, the strategy as laid down by the Committee for Imperial Defence was to carry war to her enemies' colonies. To maintain this naval supremacy, Germany's African communications system and principal ports had to be put out of action. For the Allies, successful campaigns in Germany's colonial possessions might result in their being shared by the victors as spoils of war. This was certainly a major consideration in the decision of the Commandant General of the South African Forces, General Louis Botha, and the Minister of Defence, J. C. Smuts, in the face of real opposition from Afrikaner irreconcilables, to commit South African forces to the Allied side and invade German South-West Africa, now Namibia, and later participate in the East African Campaign. Not only did Botha and Smuts covet South-West Africa as a potential province, but they hoped that if they assisted a British victory in German East Africa, parts of conquered German territory might be offered to the Portuguese in exchange for Delagoa Bay, the natural port for the Transvaal going to South Africa. In Britain, it was considered that the involvement of South Africa and her loyalty would be ensured by the prospect of South-West Africa becoming hers. For the French, invasion of Cameroon would retrieve the territory reluctantly ceded in 1911 to Germany in the aftermath of the Agadir crisis. Even Belgium, which had immediately invoked the perpetual neutrality of the Congo, now Zaire, under Article X of the Berlin Act, eagerly joined in the invasion of German African territory once her own neutrality had been violated by the Germans, in the hope that successful participation would give her a bargaining position in the eventual peace settlement. Germany's colonies were not easily defensible given Allied naval supremacy and her much smaller colonial forces. There was early optimism that the anticipated speedy German victory in Europe would avoid direct colonial involvement while achieving Germany's ambition of a Mittelafrika linking Cameroon and German East Africa, and thwarting once and for all Britain's longed-for Cape to Cairo route. But once it was clear that quick victory would not be achieved, it was perceived that protracted campaigns in Africa would tie down Allied colonial troops who might otherwise be sent to the European front. This strategy was brilliantly pursued by General P. E. von Lettow-Vorbeck, the German commander in East Africa, who engaged a combined Allied force at one time over 10 times greater than his own for the duration of the war. The campaigns in Africa can be divided into two distinct phases. During the first, which lasted only a few weeks, the Allies were concerned to knock out Germany's offensive capability and ensure that her fleet could not use her African ports. Thus Lome in Togo, Douala in Cameroon, and Swakopmund and Lüderitz Bay in southwest Africa were occupied soon after the outbreak of war. In German East Africa, British cruisers bombarded Dar es Salaam and Tanga in August, and though neither port was taken until later in the war, they could not be used by German warships. In Egypt, on the entry of Turkey into the war on Germany's side, the British defences of the Suez Canal were strengthened and a Turkish expedition repulsed in February 1915. Thereafter, Egypt served as the major base for Britain's operations against Turkey and her Middle Eastern provinces, and became the fulcrum of British power in Africa and the Middle East for the next 3 decades. The campaigns of the first phase of the war in Africa were vital to its global strategy. The campaigns of the second phase, with the exception of those mounted from Egypt against the Turkish Empire, were of marginal significance to the outcome of the world struggle. Nevertheless, the Allies were determined to conquer the German colonies, both to prevent them being used as bases for the subversion of their often tenuous authority in their own colonies, and to share them among themselves in the event of an overall Allied victory. Thus, once the South African government had put down the Afrikaner Rebellion, which had received support from the Germans in southwest Africa, it mounted an invasion of the territory, which took 6 months to complete. The Southwest Africa campaign was the only one in which African troops were not involved, since the Union generals were reluctant to arm their African population, while the Germans dared not, after having so brutally put down the Herero and Nama risings. The protracted Cameroon campaign was largely fought by African troops. Despite their superiority in numbers, the French, British and Belgian allies took over 15 months to complete their conquest of the territory. In East Africa, von Lettow-Vorbeck, appreciating that he could not hope to win the battle against forces which outnumbered his own by more than 10 to 1, determined at least to tie them down as long as possible by resorting to guerrilla tactics. Right up to the end of hostilities, he remained undefeated, leading his bedraggled column through Portuguese East Africa, now Mozambique, and then on its last march into northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, where he learnt of the armistice in Europe. At a conservative estimate, some 160,000 Allied troops were engaged by von Lettow-Vorbeck's force, which never exceeded a strength of 15,000. As in Cameroon, African troops proved vital to both sides, many of them fighting with great bravery, and proving much more effective fighters than the white South African troops, who were decimated by disease. At times, the ration for Nigerian foot soldiers was half a pound of rice a day, with nothing to go with it. The carriers suffered particular hardships, and it was estimated that at least 45,000 died from disease in the campaign. The war saw a large-scale exodus of European administrative and commercial personnel from the Allied colonies in Africa, as they left for the Western Front or enlisted in locally based regiments for campaigns elsewhere in Africa. In some parts, the European presence, already thinly spread, was diminished by more than half. In northern Nigeria, many political officers on secondment from the army were recalled to their regiments, while others voluntarily enlisted, with the result that northern Nigeria was denuded of administrators. Some divisions in northern Nigeria, like Borgu, were without any European administrator for much of the war. In northern Rhodesia, as much as 40% of the adult European population was on active service. In French Black Africa, there was general mobilization of Europeans of military age, while in British East Africa, Europeans were registered for war work. In some parts, particularly the countryside, it was rumored that the white man was leaving forever. In Morocco, where the President General, Louis Lyautey, had to withdraw so many of his troops for the European front, German prisoners of war were used on public works to persuade the Moroccans that the French were winning the war. The result of this exodus was a slowdown, if not a complete stoppage, of many essential services manned by Europeans. In certain instances, Africans were specially trained, as in Senegal, to fill the vacancies thus created. In British West Africa, others jobs hitherto reserved for whites were filled by educated Africans which, as Richard Rathbone has pointed out, goes some way towards explaining the loyalty of the elites during the war. In French West Africa, the Governor-General complained that the British, who were not subjected to general mobilization in their colonies, were taking advantage of the fact that their French allies were, by filling the trading vacuum left by the departure of French commercial agents to the front. Only in Egypt was there a net increase in the European presence, since there was an enormous influx of British troops using Egypt as a base for the Allied offensive in the Middle East. From the African point of view, perhaps even more remarkable than the apparent exodus of Europeans was the spectacle of white people fighting each other, a thing they had never done during the colonial occupation. What is more, they encouraged their subjects in uniform to kill the enemy white man, who hitherto had belonged to a clan who, by virtue of tricolour of his skin, was held to be sacrosanct and desecration of whose person had hitherto been visited with the direst retribution. Thanks for watching. Please share, like and subscribe. Thanks.